Aloha guys, this is Dr. Tom coming at you once again. Today we're going to study the fascinating topic of cell metabolism. And we're going to get into some discussions about DNA that'll be very interesting. Okay, metabolism is defined as the series of chemical reactions necessary for the use of raw material. In other words, the food that we eat. Anabolism is when we build things up. Catabolism is where we break them down. And there's a big need in the body for both of these. So memorize these. Anabolism builds up, catabolism builds down, or breaks down, into simpler substances. There's a variety of reasons in the body why we have to do that. Okay, here's a picture of a factory bringing the raw foods, or the foods that we eat, into the cell, produces proteins in this instance. Sometimes the cells will build proteins, for example, to add to the structure of the integrity of its own cell, or to export for something else. Sometimes we have to break proteins down. Now, I guess we haven't mentioned this yet, but the building blocks of proteins are called amino acids. So we attach them together, snap them together to form a protein, and we break them apart to break them back down into the component amino acids. Both of these processes takes ATP. Okay, anabolism, catabolism. Now, having said that, we're moving right along. There are three different kinds of foods: fats, proteins, and carbohydrates. Guess which one we're going to talk about now? I'll give you a hint. It says it right up here. Carbohydrates are basically sugars, guys. They form the bulk of what we eat. They are absolutely essential for life. But if you overindulge in carbohydrates, it will kill you over a period of time. It may take 40 years or 50, but it will. Or it might. This is a better way to put it. Okay, carbohydrates, organic compounds, meaning they have a carbon backbone, composed of carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen. Monosaccharides, mono means one, are single sugar compounds. The best known is glucose, which is blood sugar. Glucose is the best known and most utilized of the monosaccharides. Very important to know. Disaccharides are two sugars bonded together. The best example of that is table sugar, which is called sucrose. And then polysaccharides are mini sugars. They're long chains. What are examples of those, guys? Well, you already know them. You just may not know that they're carbohydrates. Rice, potatoes, wheat, flour, all that kind of stuff. Corn. It's all healthy for you unless you eat too much of it, and then it can kill you. Not right away, but over time. Polysaccharides are also called starches. Now, baked potatoes is a perfect example. Or rice. So the monosaccharides best known as glucose. Disaccharides best known as sucrose, table sugar, which it doesn't say here. Polysaccharides are the long chains with many sugars. So yes, rice or a baked potato are basically sugar. And we call them starch, but in essence they are. Let's see what this here chart shows us. Glucose, most important energy source. Cells can also burn fats and proteins and their constituents for energy, but most of the cells use glucose, and nerve cells like in the brain and all can only use glucose. Fructose is fruit sugar. It's converted to glucose. Galactose is. Deoxyribose and ribose are sugars that are found in DNA and RNA, respectively, the genetic material. Here's sucrose, table sugar. If you eat table sugar, it splits into glucose and fructose, fruit sugar. Maltose splits into glucose and glucose. So two glucose molecules bonded together is another type of sugar called maltose. And then lactose, the sugar that's in milk, splits into glucose and galactose. Now, you don't have to know much about that. I mean, this right here is plenty. But it's important to know. Okay, now we threw out the term starches. Here it is again. Starch is found in plant foods, digested to monosaccharides. In other words, what? I'll give you a hint. Glucose. Glucose is also stored in the body, guys. It's stored in the liver and it's stored in the skeletal muscles, a certain amount of it. And the stored form of glucose is a molecule called glycogen. This you need to know. Animal starch, excess glucose stored in the liver and the skeletal muscle. If you've heard athletes, endurance athletes and marathon runners and so forth, talk about hitting the wall, where they just suddenly run, they've expended all their, as I understand it, their stores of glycogen. Cellulose is basically wood. So yes, wood is carbohydrate. I know it's hard to believe, but it is. Non-digestible like humans, forms dietary fiber, which is good, cleans the colon out. So cellulose is not able to be digested by humans. It's mainly by bacteria. Like a cow has 4 stomachs and can digest the grass and all it eats because it's got heavy-duty bacterial action going on in those 4 stomachs. Starches are important. Glycogen is important. Be sure to know it. Uses of glucose. Burn immediately for fuel. Guys, you will die if your glucose level falls too low, just like if somebody put a rope around your neck and cinched it up and you couldn't breathe, and they cut the oxygen off. One is just as important as the other. We keep, again, a stored amount of glucose in the form of a molecule called glycogen. Stored where? In the liver and the skeletal muscles. Now, here we come to a major problem in America and worldwide society, but in America. 65% of Americans are obese or overweight. And this is a big part of the reason. Excess amounts of glucose and carbohydrate are changed into fat. Carbohydrate is not a fat, they're separate. But one can be converted to the other by the liver. We're going to talk about that shortly. Excess amounts of glucose consumption are turned into fat and stored. You cannot, in my opinion, get fat without eating excessive amounts of glucose. Or carbohydrate, I'm sorry. I keep seeing this staring me in the face. As you were, to use an army expression. They probably don't use that anymore. Now it's probably, oh, please be quiet. Okay. No, I meant carbohydrate. Excessive carbohydrate. It's a real problem, guys. All the major diseases are, not all of them, but many of them, the major killers are linked to excessive carbohydrate in the diet. I've studied natural health my entire life, and I strongly believe that. Moving right along. Okay, when we burn glucose, where do we burn it at? Well, in the mitochondria, but also out in the cytoplasm too. Because you see, there are 2 pathways to burn this stuff and break it down. One is without oxygen, which is called anaerobic catabolism, and one is with it, which is called aerobic catabolism, just like aerobics, you're dancing around there. In fact, we do both in our cells. We burn a certain amount of glucose via anaerobic respiration, and we burn typically the bulk of it with oxygen. Now that's good because with oxygen it produces a whole lot more energy. In other words, we'll go into the exact numbers here in a moment. You can take 1 molecule of glucose and burn it anaerobically, and you'll get 2 molecules of ATP. You can burn that in the aerobic method and get 38 molecules of ATP. See the difference? Okay, a couple more things. When we anaerobically burn glucose, we produce lactic acid as a side effect. You all have heard of that. It's what makes our muscles sore after we've worked out and all. So it produces some somewhat toxic byproducts. If we burn the glucose aerobically, it produces carbon dioxide, water, and ATP. Of course, ATP is what we want. Carbon dioxide is transported by the blood. We have to have a certain amount of it to maintain the pH, and the water, and then we exhale it. And guess what? Plants breathe in carbon dioxide, green plants, and exhale oxygen. We breathe in oxygen and breathe out carbon dioxide. So guess what? It's a perfect fit. It makes everything work smoothly. So these are clean byproducts. That's my point I'm trying to make here. Okay, aerobic and anaerobic catabolism. Without oxygen, it's called glycolysis, takes place out in the cytoplasm. If we're doing it all, like let's say you have to sprint, or you're in an athletic competition, and you're burning it, meaning like running full out, your body will start producing ATP through anaerobic respiration because it doesn't have time to do it with oxygen. It's like a quick shortcut. But even if you do produce it with oxygen, we still do some glycolysis. So we take a molecule of glucose, and out in the cytoplasm, it undergoes the glycolysis where 2 ATP molecules are produced. Okay, hopefully you're with me. Changes to pyruvic acid, that's all we'll say about that, and lactic acid. If you're doing it without any oxygen, this is the end product. If you have oxygen, this is why we have to breathe and why so many animals and fish and all do. Is it goes into what's called, we've already produced 2 ATP. It goes into what's called the Krebs cycle, where it produces 2 more ATP. This is in the mitochondria, or mitochondrion. Now, there's something very important here they left out, and it's called the electron transport chain. Because the electron transport chain is the next cycle after this, and it produces 34 ATP from that single glucose atom. So we have 2 from glycolysis, we have 2 from the Krebs cycle, and we have 34 from the electron transport chain, which they unfortunately neglected to put in here. So how many does that make? 1 molecule of glucose, if it's aerobically burned, yields 38 molecules of ATP as opposed to 2. Now, do you see why we breathe? Making of glucose. Well, one thing is much of what we eat, guys, is converted into glucose or broken down into glucose. The body has to have a constant supply of it. However, glucose can be made from non-carbohydrate sources. And this process is called gluconeogenesis. Now check out the word. Gluco means sugar. Neo means new. Genesis like Genesis in the good book. Making glucose from non-glucose sources. The liver is able to take fats and proteins and make them into glucose. And that process is called gluconeogenesis. But we get plenty of glucose, believe me, in modern diets from all the crappy carbohydrates we eat. Okay, we're finished with carbohydrate. Now, are carbohydrates important? Oh, absolutely. You'll die without them. Absolutely, you have to have them. You have to have all 3 of the foods. What am I saying? We eat too many of them. And poor quality, junky ones. Like a Twinkie is largely a carbohydrate. And an apple is largely a carbohydrate, or a baked potato. So which one's better? I mean, I'll let you answer that. Which one tastes good? Well, of course I'll take a Twinkie, sure. But you have to use discretion. You have to use discipline, man. Okay, lipids are fats. Lipids are organic compounds, meaning they have carbon backbones. The molecule carbon is extremely important in living things. And they're commonly called fats or oils. Most common triglycerides, phospholipids, steroids. Other relatives of lipids, lipoid substances. Cholesterol is also, it's a fatty alcohol as a type of lipid as well. So lipid is the fancy chemical word, medical word for fat. Most fats are triglycerides. They have a glycerol molecule and these 3 fatty acids attached to them. This is where all the energy is. Now, fats are not a bad thing, guys. Fats will not make you fat. Unless, guess what? If you mix it with carbohydrate, then it bombards you, it hits you. It's hard to eat enough pure fat. I mean, can you imagine eating half a stick of butter by itself? You'd be, oh. But it's very easy to eat a stick of butter dissolved in mashed potatoes. It hardly even tastes buttery. If you don't believe me, try it. So lipids have to be careful with them. But they're also a very high, rich source of energy, and that's important. Especially a few hundred years ago when people didn't know where their next meal was coming from. Okay, so lipids have twice the calories that proteins or fats have. It's a source of energy and a very important component of the cell membrane and the sheath around nerves, which we'll talk about later. Synthesis of steroids, long-term storage of energy. Okay, we're going to have to cut it short. We'll take up with this. We'll continue on the next video. Dr. Tom, signing off.